She married a silent human until he drew his blade and shook the world. Princess Lyra stood at the grand balcony of the palace, gazing out over the glittering city of Elytia, her home. The skies above were a soft violet, streaked with pale clouds as the twin moons rose, casting their silvery glow on the world below. The sounds of the city filtered up to her ears, the gentle hum of airships soaring high above, the murmur of the busy streets, and the occasional laughter from the royal garden. But tonight, Lyra felt a heaviness in her chest. Her marriage to Thorn, a human from Earth, was soon to be finalized. She had known this day would come. It was all part of the agreement between her people and the humans. The Elytian Empire needed allies, and the humans, though scattered across the stars, were a powerful force. A political marriage had been the only solution, and so it had been arranged. Lyra's advisors had told her to embrace this alliance. They had insisted that Thorn was a man of honor, someone who would bring stability to her empire. But there was something about him, something strange, that unsettled her. She had met him only a few times before, and each time his silence spoke louder than words ever could. He was a man who did not speak unless spoken to, a man who preferred the quiet over the noise of politics and courtly affairs. And yet here she was, preparing to marry him. She sighed softly, folding her hands on the stone railing. The decision was made, and there was no turning back now. But as she turned from the balcony and entered the grand hall, she found herself wishing she had known more about this man she was about to spend her life with. The hall was empty for the moment, save for the royal servants who bustled about, preparing for the evening's ceremony. The long, high walls were draped with Elytian banners, woven with golden threads that shimmered in the low light. The chandeliers above cast warm, golden hues on the marble floor. The room was grand, yet Lyra couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that seemed to linger in the air. "Your Highness," came a soft voice from behind her. She turned to see her trusted handmaiden Myra approaching with a respectful bow. "You seem lost in thought, Princess," Myra said, her eyes full of concern. Lyra smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I am simply thinking, Myra, thinking of what is to come." Myra gave her a knowing look. "You're thinking about Thorn, aren't you?" Lyra nodded. "I don't understand him, Myra. He is so silent, so distant. I know he is here because of the agreement, but—" She trailed off, unsure of how to express the feeling gnawing at her heart. "He's so different from what I imagined. I was told he would be strong, someone who could stand by me as an equal. But he speaks little, does little. How can he be the partner I need?" Myra approached her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Perhaps he is simply waiting for you to trust him, Princess. You must remember not all strength is shown in words or action. Some men prefer to let their deeds speak for them." Lyra sighed, looking out once more at the palace gardens below. "I wish I could believe that. But what if I am wrong? What if he is not the man I need?" Before Myra could respond, the doors at the far end of the hall creaked open, and Lyra's father, King Alaric, entered with a solemn expression on his face. He was a tall man with the same dark hair and sharp features as Lyra, though his eyes carried the weight of many years of ruling. "Lyra," he said in a low voice, his gaze softening as he approached. "The time has come. He is waiting." Lyra's heart sank at the mention of Thorn. "I know, father." Her father looked at her closely, his face lined with concern. "I know this is not easy for you, my daughter, but you are the future of our people. This marriage is a necessary step, one that will bring peace to both our empire and the human colonies." Lyra nodded, her throat tightening. "I understand, father." King Alaric placed a hand on her cheek, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Trust in this. Trust in what is to come." As the ceremony began, Lyra could feel the weight of her father's words pressing down on her. She stood at the front of the hall, her back straight, her head held high. Thorn stood beside her, silent as ever, his hands clasped in front of him. His presence was imposing, though his quiet demeanor made him seem like a shadow standing next to the grandness of the Elytian royal family. The ceremony was simple, yet grand. Lyra couldn't help but notice how Thorn's gaze never wavered. His eyes were dark, almost unreadable, and though his face was calm, there was a certain intensity that emanated from him. When the vows were exchanged, Thorn spoke only the necessary words, his voice low but steady. Lyra found herself drawn to him in a way she hadn't expected. There was a strength in his silence, something that seemed to hide beneath the surface. But she couldn't put her finger on it. The final words of the ceremony rang out, and Lyra found herself formally married to Thorn. The crowd cheered, but Lyra felt a strange sense of unease. What had she just agreed to? Was this truly the right path? As the guests filed out of the hall, leaving Lyra and Thorn alone, she finally turned to him. "Thorn," she began, her voice soft. "What do you think of all this, of us?" Thorn didn't respond. He merely looked at her, his dark eyes locking onto hers. There was something there, something deep, something powerful, but he said nothing. Lyra swallowed hard, her heart racing. "I suppose we will figure this out, won't we?" Still, Thorn remained silent. Days passed after the wedding, and Lyra found herself more perplexed than ever. Her life, once filled with routine and certainty, now seemed like an endless maze of questions. Every day she would rise at dawn, carry out her royal duties, and attend the many affairs of the court. Yet, despite all the work and the discussions about the future of the empire, her mind kept drifting back to Thorn. He remained the same, quiet, distant, and observant. At first, she thought it was simply the weight of the marriage pressing on him, as it had done to her. But as the days wore on, Lyra began to feel the disconnect between them more keenly. He would sit at the dinner table with her, his dark eyes watching everyone, but he rarely spoke. It was as though the words were locked inside him, never reaching his lips. One evening, after a long meeting with the council, Lyra sat alone in the royal library. The room was vast, with shelves of books lining the walls from floor to ceiling. The dim light from the chandeliers cast soft shadows across the wooden floors. It was here that she sought solace, where she could escape from the weight of her responsibilities. She picked up a book from the nearest shelf, flipping through its pages idly. Her mind, however, was not on the book in her hands. It was on Thorn. Why did he choose to remain silent? Why had he never shared his thoughts, his emotions with her? Was he simply reserved, or was there something deeper beneath the surface? She wished she could understand him. As if summoned by her thoughts, the door to the library opened quietly. Lyra turned to see Thorn standing in the doorway, his tall figure framed by the soft light of the hallway. He didn't speak as usual, but there was something in his stance that made Lyra's heart race. "Thorn," she said softly, setting the book aside. "What brings you here?" He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. For a moment, he simply stood there, looking at her. Lyra felt her pulse quicken. She wasn't sure why, but his silence felt different now, more intense. He wasn't just quiet. There was a presence about him, a power that seemed to radiate from him in waves. Lyra began, but she trailed off, unsure of how to continue. "Is everything all right?" Thorn nodded, though it was unclear if he had truly understood her question. He walked over to one of the chairs by the fireplace and sat down, his hands resting on his lap. He glanced at her once more before looking away, his eyes settling on the flames. Lyra hesitated for a moment before joining him. She sat down across from him, her heart heavy with curiosity. "Thorn, I've been wondering, why don't you speak more? It's as though something holds you back. Is there something you're not telling me?" For a long while, there was no response. Lyra held her breath, waiting, hoping that he would finally break his silence and tell her what was weighing on his mind. But instead, he just stared into the fire, his face impassive. She felt a pang of frustration. "I know this is difficult," she said, her voice softer now. "But I don't understand you. We were brought together for a reason. The future of our people depends on our unity, on our understanding of one another." Finally, Thorn spoke, his voice low and rough. "Unity is built on trust," he said quietly, his eyes still fixed on the flames. "But trust is not easily given, not when the past has taught you that words can betray you." Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She had never heard him speak so openly before. "What do you mean?" she asked, leaning forward. "What happened to you? Why are you so quiet?" Thorn was silent for a long moment before he finally looked at her. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, pain, maybe, or regret. But it was gone almost as quickly as it had appeared. "I was once a soldier," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I fought in wars that were not my own. I was trained to kill, to fight without question. But when the war ended, I was discarded, left behind." Lyra's heart ached for him as she listened. She had never thought about Thorn's past. She had never considered that he might have suffered, that his silence could be a result of pain and betrayal. "They took everything from me," he continued, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. "My comrades, my honor, my voice. I swore I would never speak again unless it was for something worth fighting for." Lyra sat there, stunned. She had no idea that Thorn had been through such hardship. She had assumed he was just a quiet man, a man who preferred silence. But now she realized his silence was a shield, one he had built around himself to protect what little was left of him. "I am sorry," she said softly, her voice filled with sympathy. "I didn't know, I never understood why you were the way you were, but now I see. You are not just a silent man, you are someone who has been through more than I can imagine." Thorn's gaze softened, but he didn't speak. Instead, he stood up, his tall frame towering over her. He looked down at her for a moment, and then, without another word, he left the library. Lyra watched him go, her heart heavy. She understood him a little better now, but she still felt the weight of their unspoken connection. They were strangers in many ways, bound together by an agreement, by a marriage that neither of them had asked for. But perhaps, she thought, they could learn to trust one another. Perhaps, in time, she could break through the walls he had built around himself. As the days went by, Lyra continued her duties, but her thoughts were consumed by Thorn. She began to notice little things about him, the way he moved, the way he observed everything with such intense focus. She began to see that beneath his silence was a man of incredible strength, a man who had endured so much and yet remained standing. And yet, there was still a part of her that longed for more. She longed for him to speak, to share his thoughts with her. She wanted to know what he thought of her, of their future, of their marriage. But every time she tried to ask, he would only respond with silence. Lyra felt a deep sadness settle over her. She had known that marrying Thorn would be complicated, but she hadn't realized just how much of a challenge it would be. He was a mystery to her, one that she wasn't sure she could solve. But she was determined to try. She couldn't give up now. Not when their worlds and the future of their people were at stake. The days that followed in the palace felt like an endless cycle. Lyra woke each morning to the duties of royalty, the endless stream of visitors, the council meetings, the decisions that weighed heavily on her shoulders. But no matter how much she tried to immerse herself in her responsibilities, her thoughts always circled back to Thorn. She had begun to notice small details about him that intrigued her. When he walked into a room, it was as though the air shifted with his presence. His silent confidence was impossible to ignore. He didn't speak much, but his actions always spoke louder than words. There was a strength in him that made Lyra wonder what kind of man he truly was. Despite her growing curiosity, she still couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he wasn't telling her. His silence was no longer just mysterious to her, it had become a wall between them, and she couldn't help but wonder if that wall would ever come down. One evening, as she sat in the palace garden watching the stars twinkle above her, Lyra heard footsteps approaching. She turned to see Thorn walking toward her, his movements slow but purposeful. He was dressed in simple clothing, his long coat flowing behind him as he made his way through the garden. "Thorn," Lyra said, her voice soft but firm. "Where are you going?" He stopped in front of her, his dark eyes meeting hers. For a moment he said nothing, but his gaze held a weight that made Lyra feel both calm and uneasy at the same time. "I'm leaving," he said quietly, his voice low, as though the words themselves were an effort. "I need to go." Lyra's heart skipped a beat. "Go where?" Thorn hesitated for a moment, and then with a quiet sigh he spoke again. "There is something I must do, something from my past that I can no longer ignore." Lyra stood up, her eyes wide with confusion. "Thorn, you can't just leave. We've been married for less than a week. What is it you're talking about?" "I have to go," he repeated, his tone steady but final. "There are things I need to face before I can be with you." Lyra felt a surge of frustration. "You don't even tell me what those things are. What am I supposed to do if you leave?" "I don't understand, Thorn. You barely speak to me and now you're going to disappear again." Thorn's gaze softened, but he didn't step forward. Instead, he stood still, his eyes locked on hers. For a long moment, neither of them moved, and the silence between them stretched longer than Lyra was comfortable with. "I cannot stay here," Thorn said, his voice softer now, but still filled with a weight of finality. "Not until I've dealt with what happened to me. I can't be the man you need if I don't first confront my past." Lyra's heart pounded in her chest. "But I don't know anything about your past, Thorn. You won't tell me anything, and that's driving me crazy. I can't live like this, not knowing what's going on inside your head." Thorn looked away for a moment, his expression distant. Lyra could see the pain in his face, and it made her heart ache. "It's not something you can understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want you to have to carry the burden of my past. It's something I need to do alone." Lyra's mind raced, trying to process his words. She understood that Thorn had been through something difficult, something that had scarred him. But how could he ask her to just let him go without ever explaining what had happened? How could she be expected to stand by his side when she knew nothing about the man she had married? "Thorn, please," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "You can't just leave. I need you here. We need to work through this together." For the first time since they had met, Thorn seemed to waver. His eyes softened as he looked at her, and Lyra could see a flicker of something in his gaze, something like regret, or maybe even hope. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I never wanted to hurt you, but I have to do this. Please understand." Lyra stood there, torn between the desire to run after him and the knowledge that she couldn't force him to stay. He had to do this on his own, just as he had told her. But the thought of losing him, of not knowing what would happen next, was almost unbearable. "Please be careful," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know what you're facing, but I need you to come back to me." Thorn nodded once and then turned away. Without another word, he disappeared into the night, leaving Lyra standing alone in the quiet garden, her heart heavy with uncertainty. The next few days were unbearable for Lyra. She spent her time in the palace, attending to her duties, but her mind was never truly focused on the matters at hand. She thought about Thorn constantly, where he had gone, what he was doing, and whether or not he would return. The silence between them had been a puzzle that she hadn't been able to solve, but now that he was gone, she felt like the pieces of their marriage were slipping through her fingers. One evening, as she sat in her chambers, her mind wandering, there was a knock at the door. Lyra looked up, startled, and then quickly composed herself. "Come in," she called, her voice steady but filled with a trace of uncertainty. The door opened and Myra entered, her expression concerned. "Your Highness," she said, bowing slightly. "You've been quite distant lately." "Is there something troubling you?" Lyra shook her head, though her heart ached. "It's Thorn," she admitted. "He's gone, and I don't know if he'll ever come back." Myra frowned, stepping closer. "I see you care for him, don't you?" Lyra hesitated, the weight of her emotions pressing down on her. "I don't know what I feel. I want to understand him. I want to know why he's so distant, why he won't share his past with me. But now he's gone, and I don't know what to do." Myra placed a comforting hand on Lyra's shoulder. "Sometimes people keep their secrets for a reason, but love has a way of breaking down those walls, even if it takes time. Trust that he will return when he's ready, and when he does, perhaps then you'll both understand each other better." Lyra nodded, though doubt still lingered in her heart. She couldn't help but wonder how long it would take for Thorn to return, and whether their marriage would be strong enough to survive the silence that had already grown between them. Days turned into weeks, and there was still no word from Thorn. Lyra spent her time buried in royal matters, but every quiet moment felt like an eternity. She began to question whether their marriage had been doomed from the start. Could two people really build a life together if they couldn't even communicate? How could she continue in a relationship with someone who wouldn't speak about the things that mattered most? But just when Lyra thought she couldn't take it anymore, a message arrived, a single note, delivered by one of the palace messengers. Her hands shook as she opened the parchment, and her eyes scanned the words written in Thorn's familiar, steady hand. "I will return when the time is right. I promise you this." The days following Thorn's departure felt like a blur to Lyra. She tried her best to continue with her royal duties, but her thoughts always returned to him. The note he had left behind was the only connection she had to him now, and she clung to the words on that piece of paper like a lifeline. "I will return when the time is right." But when would that time come? And what would be left when he finally returned? Lyra found herself wandering the palace more and more, her feet carrying her to the gardens, to the library, to the quiet corners where she once sought refuge. She no longer found solace in the familiar surroundings. The palace, which had once felt like her sanctuary, now seemed empty without Thorn's presence. She spent hours staring out over the city from her balcony, the lights of the distant buildings twinkling in the dark. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a soft, silver glow over everything. It was peaceful, but the silence in her heart was deafening. Myra noticed the change in her friend. She had always been by Lyra's side, supporting her through every decision, but even Myra couldn't hide her concern. "You need to rest," she said one evening, placing a hand on Lyra's shoulder as they walked through the gardens. "You've been running yourself ragged. You're not going to be able to lead this empire if you're exhausted." Lyra gave a half-hearted smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I don't think rest will help," she replied quietly. "I'm not sure anything will." Myra's gaze softened, and she gave a small nod. I know you care for him, Lyra. You've always cared even when you didn't understand him, but you can't force him to return. You have to trust that when he's ready, he will. You have to take care of yourself in the meantime. Lyra bit her lip, unsure of how to respond. Myra's words were comforting, but they didn't change the emptiness inside her. It wasn't just that she missed Thorn, it was that she didn't know who he truly was. His silence, the walls he had built around himself, made it impossible for her to truly understand him. And it hurt her more than she cared to admit. Days turned into weeks, and still, no word came from Thorn. It was as though he had disappeared into the universe, leaving her behind. The emptiness in Lyra's heart grew deeper, and she began to doubt everything she had once believed in. Had she made the wrong choice in marrying him? Was this marriage doomed from the start? The question lingered in her mind, gnawing at her as she attended court meetings, listened to reports from the front lines of the Empire, and made decisions that would affect the lives of countless people. She was no longer the confident, strong princess she once was. The weight of uncertainty hung over her like a cloud, and it felt as though the future of her empire was slipping through her fingers. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Lyra found herself alone in the royal library once again. The soft glow of the chandeliers illuminated the rows of bookshelves, but the quiet only seemed to deepen her sense of isolation. She had been here countless times before, but tonight, the library felt different, colder, emptier. She walked slowly through the aisles of books, her fingers grazing the spines as she passed. Her mind wandered, but her thoughts always came back to Thorn. What was he doing? Where was he? And what was it that kept him from coming back to her? The door to the library creaked open behind her, and Lyra turned to see a figure standing in the doorway. She blinked, her heart suddenly racing. There, in the dim light of the hallway, stood Thorn. He was back. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know whether to run to him or stay where she was. 1,000 emotions swirled within her: relief, joy, confusion, even anger. He had left without saying goodbye, without explaining anything, and now he had returned without warning. Thorn stepped into the room slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. His expression was unreadable, his face as calm and distant as ever. He didn't speak at first, and Lyra found herself waiting for him to say something, anything. "You're back," she whispered, her voice trembling. He nodded once, his eyes dark but steady. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice quiet. "I had to do this on my own, but I'm here now." Lyra swallowed hard, trying to steady her emotions. "Where have you been? Why didn't you tell me what you were doing?" Thorn took a step closer, his presence filling the room. "There are things I had to confront, things from my past that I couldn't run from any longer. It was something I needed to face alone." Lyra's eyes searched his face, looking for any sign of what he had been through. "What happened to you, Thorn?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why is it so hard for you to let me in?" For a moment, Thorn was silent. He stood there, his gaze shifting to the floor as though the weight of his past was too heavy to carry. Then slowly he raised his eyes to meet hers. "I wasn't always the man you see before you," he said quietly. "I've done things I'm not proud of, I've hurt people, and for a long time I thought I could hide from that. I thought I could bury it deep inside me and never speak of it again." Lyra felt her heart twist in her chest. She had known, in some way, that there was more to Thorn than he let on. But hearing him speak so openly, so vulnerably, made her realize just how much she had misunderstood him. "But you don't have to hide from me, Thorn," she said softly. "I'm not afraid of your past. I want to know you, all of you." Thorn's gaze softened, and for the first time since their marriage, Lyra saw a flicker of emotion in his eyes. He took a step closer, his presence overwhelming but comforting. "I've been afraid," he said quietly. "Afraid of what you might think of me if you knew the truth. Afraid that you might not see me the way you do now." Lyra reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "I don't care about your past. I care about who you are now, and I want us to build something together, something strong and real. I want to understand you, Thorn. I want us to move forward." Thorn looked at her for a long moment, his expression still guarded but more open than it had ever been. Slowly he nodded. "I'll try," he said softly. "I'll try to be the man you deserve." The words hung in the air between them, a promise that neither of them could break. Lyra felt a sense of peace settle over her, as if, for the first time, she could see the path forward. It wouldn't be easy, but they had both taken the first step toward healing. Thorn wasn't perfect, and neither was she, but together they could face whatever came next. They would learn to trust each other, to understand each other's pain and triumphs, and to build a future that was stronger than the past that had held them apart. The days that followed Thorn's return were filled with a quiet tension, but also with an undeniable sense of relief. Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that something important had shifted between them. The distance, the silence, the unspoken words, all of it seemed to have broken down bit by bit. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't easy, but it felt like they were finally on the same page, learning to trust each other. They spent long hours together, talking when they could, but often just sitting in silence. Lyra had learned to be patient with Thorn. She knew now that his silence was not a rejection, but a part of him, a part he was slowly learning to open up. And for the first time in their marriage, Lyra felt that maybe, just maybe, they could make this work. It wasn't just their personal struggles that weighed on Lyra's mind, though. The Empire was on the brink of war. Tensions between Aletia and the rival factions had escalated, and it seemed like peace was slipping further and further out of reach. Lyra had been trained to be a ruler, but no amount of training could prepare her for the kind of decisions she now had to make. One evening, as Lyra stood at the palace balcony, gazing out at the distant city lights, Thorn came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything at first, but she could feel his presence beside her, solid and comforting. The wind tugged at her hair, and the cool air did little to ease the heat that had settled in her chest. "Do you ever feel like everything is slipping away?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible above the wind. Thorn didn't answer immediately. He was silent, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. "I've spent most of my life feeling like I was slipping away," he said, his voice low. "But I've learned that sometimes you have to hold on tight. Even when everything feels like it's falling apart, you hold on." Lyra looked at him, her heart aching with the depth of his words. "And what if we're not strong enough to hold on?" Thorn finally turned to her, his dark eyes meeting hers. "Then we fight together, we don't give up." For a moment there was a quiet understanding between them. Lyra realized that Thorn's silence, his past, his pain, all of it had shaped him into the man he was. But in that silence he had found strength, and now he was offering that strength to her. It was a kind of strength she had never known before, one that didn't rely on words or grand gestures, but on quiet determination and trust. "I don't want to fight alone," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "I never did." "You don't have to," Thorn replied, his voice steady. "I'm here, and I'll always be here." The words hung in the air between them, simple but profound. Lyra felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She wasn't alone anymore. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she had someone by her side who understood her, someone who was willing to face the uncertain future with her, no matter how difficult it might be. The next day, news arrived that the rival factions had gathered their forces, ready to strike. The tension in the palace was palpable, and Lyra knew that the time for waiting was over. She had to act. She had to make the decisions that would determine the fate of her people. But as she stood before her council, preparing for the inevitable conflict, she found herself turning to Thorn. He stood at the back of the room, silent as always, but there was a calmness about him that steadied her. His presence was a reminder that no matter what happened, they would face it together. "Your Highness," one of the advisors said, bowing respectfully, "the enemy forces are gathering at the northern border. We must decide on a course of action." Lyra took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision press down on her. "We will defend our borders," she said firmly, her voice carrying across the room. "But we will also send an envoy. We will offer them a chance for peace. If they refuse, we fight." There was a murmur of agreement among the council members, but Lyra's eyes remained fixed on Thorn. His gaze met hers, and for a brief moment she saw a flicker of approval in his eyes. "Thorn," she said, her voice calm but resolute, "you'll lead the envoy. You know the tactics, you know how to negotiate under pressure, I trust you." Thorn didn't speak, but he nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of her decision. Lyra felt a surge of pride in that moment. She trusted him completely. And though his silence was still a mystery in many ways, she knew he had become an indispensable part of her life and her empire. The days leading up to the envoy's departure were tense. Thorn prepared for the mission in his usual quiet manner, focusing on the details, planning the best course of action. Lyra stayed by his side, offering whatever support she could, but also understanding that this was something he had to do on his own. When the day finally came, Thorn stood before her, ready to depart. Lyra felt a lump form in her throat, but she held it back. She had learned not to show weakness in times like this. "Bring them back with you," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. Thorn nodded, his expression unreadable. "I will," he said quietly, and then without another word he turned and walked out of the palace, his back straight, his head held high. Lyra watched him go, her heart in her chest, but she knew he would return. He had come back to her once, and she had no doubt he would do it again. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty. News from the front lines came in sporadically, but no one knew exactly what was happening. It was the waiting that was the hardest, the waiting and the wondering. Was Thorn okay? Had the envoy succeeded? Was peace still a possibility? And then one evening, as Lyra sat alone in her chambers, the doors to her room opened. She looked up, her heart skipping a beat, and there, standing in the doorway, was Thorn. He looked different somehow. The calm, composed man who had left the palace was now a man who had been through something that had changed him. His eyes were filled with the same quiet determination, but there was also a sense of exhaustion there. "We did it," he said, his voice low but filled with relief. "They've agreed to peace. It's not perfect, but it's a start." Lyra stood up, her heart swelling with emotion. She walked toward him slowly, her breath catching in her throat. "You're back," she whispered, her voice trembling. Thorn nodded, but he didn't speak. Instead, he reached out, his hand gently cupping her face. And in that moment, as their eyes met, Lyra knew that this was just the beginning. Whatever challenges they faced, they would face them together. She had learned that with Thorn, silence didn't mean absence. It was his way of being present, of standing by her side even when words couldn't express everything that needed to be said. As they stood there together, Lyra knew that the future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to face it. She had Thorn by her side, and together they would fight for the peace they both so desperately needed.